Hey guys, how you doing? It's Tom. I just finished reading Socialism by Ludwig von Mises. If you're not familiar with him, he's basically the father of Austrian economics. He advocates for a voluntary society with voluntary interactions between people. Capitalism, right? Capitalism, all it is in its simplest form, is free interactions between people without the government intervening, except if someone's using force, fraud, or coercion. So von Mises explains, well, first in his book, he eviscerates arguments for central planning, collectivism, socialism. He used the word more as communism. And he advocates for this voluntary society with free interactions between people. And he explains that a voluntary society creates a situation where the most amount of people have prosperity, and prosperity looks different than it does in centrally planned countries. Just look at a grocery store, for example. The modern grocery store is a miraculous feat in capitalism. The insane amount of logistics that go into getting every food item that people want on the shelves of a grocery store in a timely fashion so that the food can be bought before it goes bad, and in a society that allows the consumers to have enough money to buy that food, which in America, most people, the overwhelming majority of people, have enough money to purchase food, enough food to have a meal in their belly. Now, America could be freer and it would be more prosperous. It has been to a degree socialized, but the remnants of capitalism survive enough where there's enough prosperity where people could go to the grocery store and pick out the food which miraculously, due to the miracle of capitalism, has been perfectly distributed on the shelves of the grocery store. Now, if you look at a centrally planned country like Venezuela, where they're eating zoo animals, or North Korea, where they put pictures of food on the shelves because they don't actually have food, well, that's the difference. That capitalism, through the unseen mechanism of supply and demand, makes a situation possible where people can get what they need. Because if I start a business serving my own selfish needs, I'm going to, one, find a way to create my product as efficiently and cheaply as possible, because if I don't, I'll have a deficit and I'll lose money and go out of business. And two, setting the price where I make the most money off of it. And that price is going to be the perfect balance of the most money I could charge for, where I get the most amount of people to buy my product, and in turn, I'm serving society through voluntary exchanges because people are buying what they want, buying what they need from me. I'm making money, my business is profitable, I'm hiring people, and they're getting what they need, whether that's, if we take the grocery store example, a hamburger, ketchup, onions, pickles, buns, soft drink, whatever it might be, just simplifying things with the grocery example. Whereas when you take the central planning, right, you're asking a bureaucrat, and we know how effective bureaucrats are, just look at America's healthcare system, look at the American education system. You're asking a bureaucrat to centrally plan the entire production process. Whereas in a voluntary society, I'm over here figuring out on my own, all right, how do I produce this pen as cheaply as possible so that I can get it out to market? And I'm going to find a way to do that in which it's profitable, because if it's not, I'll go out of business. But in the centrally planned society, it's much more difficult from a bureaucrat not involved in the intricate process, and think how many intricate processes go on throughout society, not involved in that process, to centrally plan and make it so that the economic process remains profitable and that the GDP continues to grow and wealth is built up within society. So in capitalist societies, free voluntary exchange, wealth is built up, whereas in centrally planned societies, it's more difficult to build up wealth because the central planners can't get it right like the capitalists can under the natural arm, the invisible hand of supply and demand economics. He then talked about the moral aspects of this. That a voluntary society, a voluntary economic system, is the only moral economic system. Because if the economic system is not voluntary, by its very nature, things are being done through force, fraud, and coercion. You're telling an entrepreneur, you have to create this, you have to provide this service to these amount of people, even if you want to be on vacation, even if you want to be whatever you want to be. If you don't do what the government says, you are going to meet the full force of the government, thrown in a prison cell, arrested. If you don't produce this amount of product, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be paid this amount. It doesn't matter what supply and demand says. It doesn't matter if it's profitable to you. If you're poor, this is what you're going to make. And this, you could just tell by the very nature of this that it's very inefficient, unlike supply and demand economics, which are very efficient. And then, of course, you can't have profits. You have to distribute the wealth of a society, the shrinking wealth of the society amongst the people. And in order to do that, right, taxation, by its very nature, is theft. Because what you're saying is, if you don't give your property, your wealth, to the government, then the government will arrest you and throw you in a prison cell. What can be more immoral than that? On the one hand, you have a voluntary society in which you create a product and you could sell it to someone and they could buy it, and if they don't, just fine. And if you run it poorly, then you run out of money and you find something else to do. But everything's completely voluntary versus this centrally planned society in which if you don't do a certain thing, if you don't give up, if you don't create a certain product, sell it to a certain amount of people at a certain price, if you don't give your profit, if you have one, to the government, then government officials, the police, will show up with guns, take your money, lock you in a prison cell, and possibly murder you. Well, of course, the latter is an immoral system. And Ludwig van Mies does a great job of explaining that. He also explains that you cannot have freedom without the ownership of private property. So people who advocate for the government taking over certain sectors of the economy, they're advocating for the erosion of freedom and liberty. Because if you can't own property, if you don't own a house, whatever it might be, then by its very nature, you can't be free, right? You can't own property, grow trees on that property, cut the trees down, make it into chairs, make it into products, and sell it because you don't own that. And the government could take away everything you have, or really you don't have anything, so the government can make it where you are poor and broke very, very easily without the right to own private property. Private property is the backbone of freedom, of individual liberty. It's what America was founded on, and why capitalism is so important. The other thing that capitalism does is it raises the level of what poverty is. We talked about how supply and demand allows for a more efficient economy, which builds wealth, which is why being poor in the United States, people eat so many hamburgers that they get fat and die young of cardiac arrest, whereas being poor in Venezuela, you eat zoo animals until they run out of zoo animals, and then you starve to death. Because centrally planned economies, socialist economies, communist economies view resources as finite. Everything is finite, so everything's restrict. Whereas capitalist, free societies view wealth as ever expanding. Wealth can be accumulated. And because of that, the floor of what poverty is changes. So now poverty in the United States of America is really fat people. Well, in Africa, where people are much less free, that's just unheard of. These people, they starve to death. But if you have a free society, what is poverty changes. And another interesting aspect of how that changes is capitalism allows for innovation, right? So, say I wanted to make a product. Well, you could have a central planner say, okay, this is how we're going to make that product, and that's that. Or you could have, take America for example, you could have a society of 350 million people, and anyone could make that product. They could all try to make it at the same time. And you'll get situations where many people are competing, trying to make similar products, the same products at the same time. And instead of having one central planner, you have 355 million different minds working on the same thing, which leads to innovation, which leads to much greater production, which leads to things like a society of people on their computers, on their laptops, on their cell phones. So if you look at what poverty is, talk about raising the floor of poverty. Someone who is poor in the United States of America, in many ways, could live a more luxurious life, at least materially, although I don't view material gain as luxury, but they can have a car, right? You could be relatively poor, have a car, have a cell phone, have tons of food to eat. You could pick your restaurant, being poor in America, whereas maybe 100 years ago, you didn't have a cell phone. All that innovation is made possible, right? You didn't have an iPad. Capitalism made Steve Jobs possible. So innovation is pushed forward by capitalism, which again feeds into that capitalism views wealth as ever expanding, and in these centrally planned economies, you don't see nearly the same innovation. And that's why wealth is viewed as finite. It's not expanding. What is poverty doesn't improve. So having free and voluntary exchange, one is the moral way to do things, and two, it's the way to create innovation and prosperity in the world. Jordan Peterson often points out that since the year 2000, 50% of the poverty in the world has been eradicated. And that's not talked about a lot. But that's largely because the advancements of capitalism. Now, capitalism is always under attack by the government, which controls the academic system and instead pushes for central planning because it increases the government's wealth and power. But in reality, capitalism has allowed for the greatest increase in wealth in the history of humanity. Increases in wealth that we just couldn't even imagine. I mean, just look at the world now compared to 200 years ago. And the innovation, the technologies that we have at our fingertips. And this is all because free and voluntary societies. And that's all Austrian economics is. That's all capitalism is. It gets a dirty rap. But in reality, it is free and voluntary exchange between people. It is allowing people to be free and not under the authoritarian hand of government. Now, capitalism is constantly attacked, but what's being attacked isn't capitalism. We haven't lived in full capitalism. It's cronyism. It's a corporate government monopolistic system where the corporations and the government are in bed together using government authority to squash free exchanges and to give certain people advantages over other people to create artificial corporate government monopolies. It is the smashing of capitalism. It has been the erosion of capitalism that is actually used to attack the capitalist system. What we have to get is a situation where the government is removed from the economic system so they can't give certain businesses unfair advantages because those businesses have bought off the government. And you also have to eliminate the situation where certain industries are artificially protected by the government. Take the pharmaceutical industry, for example. You cannot sue the pharmaceutical industry for vaccine injury. Well, if you have that, then you're incentivizing a lot of corruption. I've thought a lot about it. This isn't in von Mises' book, but I wonder if most of the problems in society, especially involving corporatism, could be solved if, instead of corporations being viewed as their own separate entity, the people who run corporations could be held liable if what their corporations do is proven to have some malintent behind it. This way, people have personal responsibility. Again, that feeds into freedom. As long as we have personal responsibility and more individual freedom and liberty, we will get better societies. But I wanted to do a quick book review. I hope I did a good job of articulating this. This is very difficult stuff. I know economics might not be the most exciting topic for everyone. I actually really enjoy it, but I strongly recommend reading Socialism by Ludwig von Mises. Thank you so much for your support, and I will catch up with you soon.